Good evening, everybody. You're very welcome to this evening's seminar. It's going to be a very busy few days in the Department of Sociology. On Monday of next week, we have a visiting scholar from Iceland who will be talking about mixed methods from her PhD work. As soon as that's over, we're coming back over to this room to launch the next edition of Succolas, the Limerick Student Journal of Sociology. It gives me great pleasure as head of department to introduce the seminar series. The seminar series is supported by the Irish Social Sciences Platform, the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences and Department of Sociology. Over the next 7 seminars, we're going to be given a really sort of golden opportunity to engage critically with a variety of key themes, including questions arising from regeneration, community development, youth crime and social regeneration. You'll have seen the posters around. You'll have seen the key themes, you'll have seen the lineup. It's a really stellar lineup of speakers, including Anoop, who is starting the series for us this evening. It's a great lineup of speakers over the next number of weeks. And it's an interesting model as well in the sense that this is, for want of a better phrase, a boring old module that you have to do as part of your programme, but it's also a series of discussions that the wider campus community and the wider community can attend and engage with. So you're all very, very welcome. I want to thank particularly the organisers, Dr. Martin Power and Dr. Cleona Barnes, for their outstanding energy in organising these important seminars. So, to this evening's speaker then. Anoop Nayak is Professor of Social and Cultural Geography in Newcastle University. He has previously been a lecturer in Cultural and Media Studies at Liverpool John Moores University and an ESRC Research Officer at the University of Birmingham. Anoop's main areas of research are in cultural geography, with particular specialisms in race, ethnicity and migration, geographies of youth, masculinities, gender and culture. I'm delighted to welcome Anoop back because he's previously visited us here in the Department of Sociology to deliver a paper at the Researching Young Lives conference, which was held in April 2010. This evening Anoop will talk to us about how, in an insecure post-industrial society, young working class men must forge new transitions, involving a reshaping of a whole way of life with the erosion of traditional labour and leisure lifestyles. His talk would explore, among other things, the subtle and explicit demarcations that distinguish the rough from the respectable working class. Ultimately, Anoop will make a case that social class is of marked and continuing salience in youth culture. All yours.
Well, thanks for such a warm welcome. I almost feel like I don't need to say anything now. You sort of summed up my paper better than I probably could do myself. I'd like to thank Martin for the invitation and to you all as well for being here. I mean, it's a great room and it's great to see so many people. So, as Owen said, I'm going to talk a little bit about my work on masculinities and social change, and hopefully through bringing together ideas about identity, we can think through what are the kind of bigger structural changes happening beneath the kinds of everyday identities we might see on the street, and I dare say you'll see here. Okay. As Owen was saying, this is really a talk that's sort of generated out of research that I've done in Newcastle upon Tyne in the northeast of England. And so I'm going to tell you about the context of that area. And there's probably hopefully some connections with things going on here in Limerick. So, for those of you that don't know about the northeast of England, it has a history that's really embedded within a kind of heavy manufacturing set of industries, particularly coal mining industry, heavy engineering, and shipbuilding. So this is the kind of its past history. And I've been living there, and I've been very interested. I mean, it's been post-industrial in the time I've been there, but watching the kind of changes that have happened to this place, and looking at that and trying to understand what is happening on the ground. How do people understand their lives and the kinds of structural changes that they see around them? And my interest in a number of ways has also been with issues of masculinity. How a gender identity is being forged and reforged in the new contemporary moment. So, within the North East then, like I said, it had this heavy industrial labour, and that was a kind of cornerstone upon which it understood its identity. Okay? A region that's known for hard work, for community, for families, a very masculine type of image that was about being a pit worker. And I'll return to that notion of the pit worker in a moment, because that was quite crucial to understanding some of the local identities I'm going to be talking about. But importantly, work is not just a social activity. It's not just something that we do, but it exists in the memories and is embodied in different types of traditions. So I've kind of argued that work isn't just a social practice, but it's also something that's deeply emotional, that it carries locally generated effects and feelings. So if those effects and feelings can linger on long after a pit shuts down, or a factory closes, or a mill ceases to work. So I'm kind of interested in the kind of remnants and structures of feeling, to use a term from Raymond Williams, that kind of coexist inside communities. So if we think about the northeast of England, and in particular the city of Newcastle, which you can see in that bottom picture there, throughout the late 90s onwards, it's undergone rapid post-industrialisation and a complete transformation of its base. It's moved away from its manufacturing industry, from its engineering base, and it's instead towards a kind of service sector economy. An economy built around bars, nightclubs, and more recently, art and culture as well. So it's tried to rebrand itself. It's a city that's tried to go in for a type of rebranding based less on its economy and more on its culture. Okay, so that is a kind of short little history of some of what's been happening in Newcastle and in many towns up and down Britain, really. Okay, so particularly making use of waterfront areas that were once the heartland of industry for shipbuilding and so on, and turning them into places of consumption. So one of the things that I became interested in then was looking at the way in which that change is embodied by young people. And as early as 1977, Paul Willis, a sociologist of education, wrote a famous book called Learning to Labour. And Willis's thesis was, in a nutshell, was pretty much that schools were preparing young men for the workplace, for the factory. Okay? That young men didn't like schooling, didn't like the middle class culture of schooling, and would resist it in certain ways. They'd play up with the teacher, they'd form a sense of collective camaraderie and become one of the lads. And what Willis argued, and it's a controversial argument, but nevertheless he argued, was that these tools of resistance, collectivity, shared humour, and so on, were exactly the skills that were required for dealing with the mundane world of the factory and the shop floor. So Willis argued that the architecture that was established at school level for working class kids was being replicated apt in factory life. So that was his notion. I found when I was going into schools that there was still a lot of young men that were highly resistant to education and played up against the teachers. Okay? So I immediately became struck then that what are young men doing in a post-industrial world where you can no longer learn to labour, where those industrial jobs no longer exist. Okay? So maybe this puts something of a question mark around Willis's significant study, nevertheless. And perhaps it's the case now, as Linda McDowell, an economic geographer, has argued, that young men are learning to serve, the title of one of her articles. And she's written a book called Redundant Masculinities, in which she kind of has argued that young men are no longer learning to labour, but are learning to serve. So in other words, they're becoming attuned to having to work in the service sector. Okay? So working in bars, cafes, restaurants, and sports shops, and so on and so forth. So the sense is here at a kind of broader sociological level that we've moved away from a time of stability, a job for life and security, to a high risk and more complex world in which young people are managers of risk, but also, you could argue, have greater opportunity. Okay? They're no longer sent down the pit or sent into a mundane factory life of doing repetitive acts. So the notion of kind of risk is filtered into a lot of youth studies. People talk about risk biographies and so on. So greater choice, but also greater risk. So these are kind of features, it's said, of post-modernity or of late modernity, that we live with more risk, but we also have more choice and flexibility. So it's a set of contradictions that are being opened up in sociological thinking. Okay? So one of the things that I've been interested in is looking at the way in which youth studies has changed. So I mentioned Willis's work. He was kind of an early writer, as I said, and most of the kind of early work that happened in the 1980s on young people focused upon institutions, so particularly schooling, workplaces, youth clubs. Issues of unemployment were integral. From the late 90s onwards, what we've seen develop is as a new series of studies, often that have come about through postmodern thinking, and a lot of work particularly on consumption, the nighttime economy, lots of work on young people and drugs, and a very hedonistic kind of set of colourful portraits. So, looking at that, and I am kind of simplifying this, but it seemed to me that we had a kind of fairly monochrome set of accounts that were in the 1980s that were kind of very much geared around young people and unemployment and social structures, towards a set of accounts that are kind of more about dance, consumption, and so on. So I've kind of loosely characterised this as a manoeuvre from workplaces to cool places, which was the title of a 97 collection edition by Skelton and Valentine, a book called Cool Places, The Geographies of Youth. And I think that kind of, for me, marked a shift in how young people were being seen. And what I want to argue today is that both of these positions are both kind of portraits or representations. And perhaps I want to really argue for some kind of middle ground, for a need to bring together structure and culture, for bringing these two things together. Okay? So within youth studies we have almost two kind of, even now, two polarised positions. A position which has been developed around youth transitions, which is transitions from school into the workplace, or into motherhood, for example, or even into drug careers. And we have which are kind of very much focused on how young people interact with social structures. And then this kind of cultural studies work, which has been more about young people in the internet or retail, new technology, and so forth. So I do want to kind of tell a story that's going to hopefully weave these aspects of cool places and workplaces, or cultures and structures together. So, to try to elucidate the impact that recent transformations are having upon masculine identities, my focus today, I want to draw upon a multi-site ethnography that I've been involved with. And I'm going to speak about two groups of young men. There were actually three groups in my study, but for reasons of time and whatever, I'm going to just talk about two particular groups here. A group called the Real Geordies, and a group known as Chavas in the northeast. The term chav has now become very popular, and they would kind of link up with chav. So I'll tell you a little bit more about them. So the first group that I'm going to talk about are a group called the Real Geordies, as I said, and these young men, they all came from working class backgrounds, and I got to know them over a period of time in school, and also got to see them on several occasions on nights out in Newcastle city centre. I'd also bump into them sometimes in supermarkets when they'd say hello to me, or when they're working in petrol stations. And it became apparent that they were going to school, but they also had these part-time jobs. So they were players at a low level in the economy, and would use that money for hedonistic expressions of activity, going out drinking, having fun together, and so on. But it took a while for me to realise that one of the things these young men shared was a particular class set of biographies. So it was only really kind of 4 to 6 months into the research that I realised that their deep friendships, which were genuine, which they had, also spoke about a particular set of class connections that they had. They weren't just working class youth. They actually all came from backgrounds, with the exception of I think 2 of them, that were involved with I suppose what you call a kind of aristocracy of labour. So they had fathers, grandfathers and uncles that had been shipbuilders, had worked in sheet metal industries, were mechanics, were engineers, had a skill set of labour, if you like. Okay? So it was intriguing to me to realise a similarity in their backgrounds, and they formed these thick bonds together and deep friendships. And I became interested in what it meant to be a Geordie, because these young men were passionate Geordies. Okay? They call themselves the Real Geordies, and this was a term they used. We said, we're real Geordies, and they made distinctions between those who they saw as not real Geordies in their terms. And I constantly was going, well, okay, what is it about you that makes you real? And they told me that being a Geordie, it's all about passion. And they were big football supporters of the local club. And they said that was important, to go and pay your respect, by going to the game. They said being a Geordie was very much about having a laugh. It was about circuit drinking. It was about being embedded in the local community through these acts. And what struck me was that none of these lads had an understanding that Geordie actually has a past association with being a pit worker. Okay, so the term Geordie has various competing industrial connections. Some say it was a term for George Stephenson's lamp, safety lamp, which was used down the mine, the Geordie Stephenson. So it's got a few different definitions, but nevertheless it does have this kind of strong industrial connotation to it. So I became very much interested in what it means to be a Geordie when there's no pits anymore. Okay? How can that identity still survive? So for these young men, it was very much about football, drinking, having a laugh, and so on and so forth. Okay, so immediately I was learning something here. I was learning that Geordie hadn't died out, despite a kind of whole section of industrial labour being erased. But these local identities linger, they stay on. So what was also interesting then was that there'd been a kind of shift, what I kind of rather crudely call a shift from kind of coal mining to clubbing. The North East has been rebranding itself around its nighttime economy. So in 2003 it became known as the Party City, and it had a caption that called "Feel the Buzz." This was its caption: "Come to Newcastle, feel the buzz." And it was appealing to stag and hen parties, and it had, it's received a lot of income through that, and there's been a lot of regeneration that's happened through the opening up of bars and the opening up of hotels around particular areas. Now that economy has shifted, and the local authority wants to move away from that feel the buzz image, largely because it's brought some social problems with it. The kind of that you get with stag and hen parties. I imagine probably some similarities with Dublin, where it can be almost an overkill, and they want to get back to something else. So more lately, we've been trying to push the culture more, and with the Baltic Arts Cinema and Baltic Arts, which is up on the waterfront in Gateshead, and trying to kind of develop a kind of broader portfolio, but nevertheless it pushed this consumption element. And a number of kind of bars have opened up that have been glass-fronted, full of shiny chrome, and pumping out loud house music. And these were the favoured watering holes of the real Geordies. So they'd pass through these on a night out, and I observed them quite a few times. And it became apparent that actually they're involved in a kind of old-fashioned tradition, really, of circuit drinking, which has long been popular in the North East, a kind of prominent form of working class promenading. So they followed these structures and actually followed the routines of the Friday night, Saturday night that were familiar to the region. One of the kind of differences, I suppose, was that used to be very male-based. Often took place in working men's clubs and so on and so forth, and in the kind of local pubs. But now women were as much a part of this nighttime economy as anybody else. Paul Chatterton and Robert Hollands have written a lot about new drinking practices and corporate ownership in the nighttime economy. And they've spoken about the kind of changing drinking environment, the perpendicular drinker who goes in, gets a drink, there's music going on, like the television screens, there's a different atmosphere in these places. Okay? And the real Geordies loved going to these places. They were exciting. They liked to be seen out in the town. They didn't have a lot of money, but going to a number of places and just having a bottle of lager in each place meant that you could kind of increase your visibility and also the chance for funny happenings on a night out. So they loved kind of frequenting these range of places. So one of the things that they were obsessed with was this sense of, if you like, being real, being the real Geordies. And it was clear to me that so much of that notion of identity was built around consumption. Football, clubbing, going out, etc. And it was also an embodiment of configurations of whiteness. So to be a Geordie was implicitly you had to be white, preferably male, and this was repeated through all kinds of metaphors that were used. That, as far as they, in their eyes, being a Geordie meant, being a true Geordie man was being the breadwinner, being the backbone of the nation, or the salt of the earth. These kind of white working class metaphors continually resonated in their talks. So, when I spoke to them, they spoke about themselves in very straightforward ways. We take no shit. We give as good as we get. We know who we are at the end of the day. These kinds of statements peppered their accounts. And, as I said, as local lads, they shared familiar labour histories. They had fathers that were workers, as offshore operators, glazers, fitters, mechanics, and so on and so forth. So their way of talking and self-presenting was familiar to their biographies. They were straightforward, honest labourers. This was the kind of image that they had in their minds. So these nights out that they had, often there was a lot of horseplay, and funny stories regularly occurred. So constantly they kind of reminisced about funny nights out. Such as the time Philo ended up urinating from the Tyne Bridge and ended up with piss streaked trousers. Or the time Fat Mal fell asleep on his kebab and chilli sauce. And they got great pleasure out of telling these tales. And what I realised that was going on was that it was important to take these narratives seriously, because the stories were much about working class culture and how people do sociality. They're about the ways in which people come together and understand themselves in the worlds that they inhabit. So it wasn't just the events that happened on a night out that were important, but there was the way in which they were narrated constantly and shared and memorialised that was important. Okay? So through these ways I'm suggesting, these became ways of doing class in new times. So the real Geordies were incredibly nostalgic about the region. They had a great sense of local identity, they were proud of it, and their stories would commemorate themselves and the places they inhabit on a regular basis. Now, I'm borrowing a phrase here from Bob Connell, or Raymond Connell as he's now called, a Masculinities writer in Australia, who's talked about body reflexive practices. And I'm going to suggest that this is a very useful term for thinking about the activities of drinking, football, and the kind of horseplay that these young men got up to. And Connell suggests that body reflexive practices involve social relations and symbolism. They may involve large-scale social institutions, and how particular versions of masculinity are constituted in circuits as meaningful bodies and embodied meanings. And he says that through, this is kind of the nub of it really, the important bit, he says through body reflexive practices, more than individual lives are formed, a social world is formed. So I want to suggest that the real Geordies were involved in particular body reflexive practices, drinking, consumption, fashion, football, etc. That was about the creation of their social worlds. A new creation of Geordie identity that could still continue to be preserved and recuperated in the present. Okay? So this identity then is being, isn't being erased. It hasn't been eroded, as you might think, with the end of industry, but it's being recuperated through these body reflexive practices. Okay? So is everyone with me so far? All right. Okay. So, having worked that through now, I want to take you to the second group of young people that I want to talk about. And it's interesting because when I was doing this work, these young men call themselves, and I say young men, and also young women as well, Charvers. And this was a term that was around very early on in Newcastle, and more recently it's become known as chaff, since that's become a kind of media phrase that's been taken on. But the term Charver has long been around in the North East, and I dare say in other places too. So, if the real Geordies are the embodiment of a kind of respectable working class, at least this is how they produce themselves and narrate themselves, the real Geordies were homeowners, they came from these respectable backgrounds, their parents were in employment, they had an aura of white respectability about them, they too were. They saw Charver kids who were from long-term unemployed families as being not respectable. But there was kind of important race and class overlaps that I want to try to pull out for you today, because often race and class can be spoken through one another, so I want to kind of draw upon that a little bit more. So I've described the real Geordies, the way in which they drew upon these emblems of whiteness to kind of authenticate their being. And in doing so, it seemed that the Chavas could be seen as not quite white. And I'm going to kind of say a little bit more about that. Because the etymology of Chav is a kind of interesting one. It's a term that's kind of popular amongst Romani communities, traveller communities, and it's been a term for a kind of small child. There is some competing definitions though. The media have talked about it as CHAV, as chav, being council house and violent, and so imputing it there as immediately as something that's not respectable. But amongst the young men and young women that I spoke with, Chavet also had connotations that were about lower working class names. So they said, oh, you're a Shava. It means, and they said Shava, and would say it was like a combination of being a Sharon and Trevor. It was the two words put together. So there were all kinds of interesting, localised inflections that were given around the term Chav, Chava, and so on. And sometimes, as I said, these could be about class, but they could have these kind of ethnicised dimensions. So the connections with Romani and Gypsy and traveller people. And also, I also heard phrases being used like Charvala, which is an Indian word for a tea servant. So there were all kinds of interesting race and class dynamics that were going around about being a Chava. But the essential bit was, it was about being about a lower working class identity, not a skilled identity. It was linked with unemployment, and it had these racialised overtones. So I'm going to suggest, and I'll say a little bit more about this, that there were kind of three sort of reasons why these kind of racialised overtones came to the fore. One of them was this kind of Romani connection that was there, and perhaps there's a nice parallel, I think, with the kind of white trash urban underclass that you get in the States. Kind of trailer park trash is the kind of term that's used for kind of southern whites that are unemployed and so on. So, you know, that phrase, the white trash, I think has this kind of particular resonance, that you're kind of white on one hand but not respectable. So I've kind of spoken about the Chavs or the Chavs as being not quite white. Their status is in question, you know, due to being part of this urban underclass. But importantly, the Chava kids were, and Chava families were seen to be located in a particular area of Newcastle. And this was an area in which I lived for 2 years. And that was, parts of that, of the West End, were known as being associated with Chava families, largely because it contained people that were socially impoverished. And that area, like most impoverished areas, also contained a high level of migrant communities, including the South Asian community. And it also seemed that by dint of living alongside these migrant communities, asylum seekers, refugees, and an established South Asian community, it was almost as if their not quite whiteness was solidified. Okay? So they lived in this part of the area. It was almost that geography had an impact upon how these young people were seen. And there's also a long-standing 19th century set of discourses around race and class that talk about the working class as being dirty, diseased, overbreeding, and so forth. And those terms have been used certainly been used for a long time against immigrant communities. So the parallels with race and class is something here that I've wanted to pick out. The little image that you can see there, this kind of rat boy image, I mean, this was how people spoke about Chavs and Chavas. There were rats, and the families, like I said, overbreeding. This rat image was really commonplace. And the term rat boy was actually a term that was used by the local press to describe a young 6-year-old at the time, and I think then he became 10 and eventually arrested him. He was a young lad who was involved in a lot of car crime and would escape through the Biker Wall, which is kind of a housing complex, and it's almost like a maze. And the police could never catch him because he would kind of escape through the maze of the Biker Wall. I mean, they called him Rat Boy as a result, and that became a kind of local mythology. And it span out then to include anyone that was seen to be a Chav or Chava, or the rat boys and rat girls. So that kind of animalistic image became very kind of dominant in these local circuits. And rats, of course, I think epitomise notions of disease, invasion, breeding, etc. So they become so much more kind of than just a mere symbol. Okay? So it's these kind of notions of excess and the effects that they carry, the effects, the emotions that I think I want to kind of try to tap into here. Okay. So just to give you a sense of the way that these young people were stigmatised. This is kind of, I've received several conversations that kind of spoke about them as being animalistic. So this is a young woman, Michelle, from school-based ethnographies. She's saying, oh yeah, they think they're dead hard, Sam. You see them walking around the town and everything, Michelle, yeah, with their head down and arched back, they think they're dead good. James says, yeah, they think they're real gangsters. And they went on to talk about them as chavas and chavas having what they call a monkey walk. And there was a particular walk, a loping stride that they would evoke. And, they compared it to kind of an ape-like walk with kind of your knuckles grazing on the floor, rolling your shoulders, spitting was another thing, wearing baseball caps, and there was a kind of leery attitude that came with it. So this was kind of mimicked by a lot of the young people, and they said, yeah, you can see chavas, who they are, we know who they are, through their walk. And notions of a monkey walk actually go back to, again, back to the 19th century, and notions of promenading. So there was also kind of all kinds of connections here that I managed to pick out historically. So these aren't entirely new things. Vocally as well, people said you can tell someone's a chava by their rough accents. It's rougher than the usual Geordie accent. And this kind of thing was kind of constantly mimicked in popular culture. I suppose Vicky Pollard has been the kind of classic kind of representation that we've seen, but also in comics like The Viz, Tasha Slacker, the kind of scrunch back hair for women, smoking, tracksuits, and the kind of brassy jewellery that I showed you earlier. And I should have said that brassy jewellery again is another important connection to Romani and travel communities. So again, those kinds of things working through and against one another. Okay. So, yeah, so dress becomes really important here. I should have said that the real Geordies dressed in very smart attire. They wore shirts, often branded shirts. They were very into kind of their brands and had immaculate hairstyles. And what was interesting was, for me, it was almost like an out-of-school uniform. They were all looked the same, these lads. It was incredible. Yet they hated their school uniform, but they were all dressed in almost exactly the same ways. And I think through that evinced their own class roots. Chavas were seen to wear tracksuits, baseball caps, brassy jewellery, and because of that, would be excluded from the nighttime economy. Okay, so they couldn't inhabit a lot of the local bars and clubs, and would be turned away not only because of their dress, but there was actually a number of posters that would say no chavs allowed and no chavas allowed, and I collected a lot of flyers which said this, so it was quite explicit form of class discrimination here that was going on. So something quite interesting there about how the nighttime economy is being produced and who it's being produced for. The middle class people and respectable working class people. Okay, so I lived on one of these estates for 2 years and it was really important actually because I got to know these families, at least the kids, not only in school but observe them out of school. And that was really important because they had very low attendance rates. And it became apparent to me that the low attendance rates they had, etc., were also partly because of the kinds of multiple struggles that people were involved with in the neighbourhood. Heavy crime was going on, there was a lot of drug use, particularly also amongst the parental generation, and this kind of intergeneral unemployment that had gone on, intergenerational unemployment. So heavy kind of problems that were there. And for many of the young men, in particular, crime wasn't seen as a bad thing in and of itself. As I began to understand it, it appeared that crime was seen as a career for some people. They spoke of it as grafting. Okay, so the young men spoke about it as grafting, and rather than being against what their parental expectations, many of them, stole timber from local yards and so on, and were doing it for their fathers. Okay, so they've been, they were doing this with full parental consent. So there was some kind of interesting things going on here. So there were lots of tensions about young people on the streets and the lack of opportunities that they had. So a broader moral panic then about young people, and particularly about the way in which crime could offer a kind of apprenticeship for them. So one of the things that went on a lot with the house burglaries was that it would often be children, not even youth, so children kind of 6 years old that would be going into places and taking out goods. And this was because older youth would get them to do it, basically. And knowing that a child is 6 and 7 isn't going to get prosecuted by the law. So there was all kinds of neighbourhood knowledge that was being shared and circulated in these spaces. Okay? So I realised that it was important to take these local knowledges seriously and realise how people were responding to hard times and responding to difficult periods. Okay? It's not to in any way romanticise what's happening here and the real violence that is going on in these places, because it is real, but to begin to understand how they're adapting strategies to make this work within this neighbourhood. Okay. So let's have a look now at the way in which people talk in very emotive ways about what's happening in the neighbourhood and attribute it to what they think of as chavs or chavas. So these are just a couple of responses I pulled out. There's many in there. I did some work with the BBC and we set up a website. So there were lots of statements written. A lot of them were kind of vitriolic and so on. But so I just thought I'd pick out a couple here. From one of the kind of web respondents. I've had several friends jumped and beaten up by chavas, high on dope and tanked up on cider. They are scum. Most of them will never attempt to get a job. They're happy to play the system for every penny they can. They turn to crime to fuel their binge drinking and drug addictions. So this is a kind of popular perception here. Another person says, yeah, yesterday evening I had my car window smashed because someone threw a brick at it. Let me tell you, there's nothing positive to say about chavas, the thick, pathetic little toe rags. The only consolation for the civil members of society, so again these demarcations happening, is that these little morons are set for a life of misery, either behind bars or unemployed. Chavas, the real dregs of society. So a host of negative discourses about chavas was being produced in the local community. And what was interesting was, who is a chava? Do young people actually recognise themselves as a chav or chava? And it was interesting that this term was being used to describe almost any young person that was in a tracksuit. Okay, so there were forms of knowledge that were being ascribed to people, and I use knowledge in the loosest sense because it was highly emotive and had huge implications for young people's mobility around the city. So young people also spoke about being chavved. And being chavved meant you had a knife put to you and you were asked to hand your money over and your mobile phones and so on. So being chavved or being taxed was a phrase that young people used. And again, that term being chavved made me think about very early work by Stuart Hall and his colleagues at the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies. They did a study on mugging and how the term mugging, which was a term used originally in New York and the States, came to be applied in the UK. And when the term mugging came to be applied in the UK, it was specifically used for crimes that were committed involving the black community. So somehow the term mugging got set apart here as a black crime. So Stuart Hall and his colleagues look at that. And I want to argue that the term being chav in a similar way becomes associated with a particular group. Okay? It's just robbery, it's just violence, it's the same set of practices, but it becomes located to a particular class definition. So again, the kind of racial overlay that you can see happening there. So what I want to suggest then is that these discourses that surround chavs and chavas are evocative of particular modern day anxieties. Anxieties about youth, fear of crime, economic displacement, and a loss of class respectability. Unlike black youth, chavas were represented as gangsters, rogues, apes, society's evolutionary missing link in the chain of human order. So society has gone wrong. This is the kind of message that was constantly filtered back. And it allowed notions of the rough and the respectable to come into being. The sense that there were respectable members of the community and then there was this rough edge. Okay? So these kind of divisions then, what they conceal, of course, is a broader sense of social and economic disenfranchisement. And the kind of bigger story that I've been telling you about related to the North East and to other places, okay, about its changing industrial history. So, as I'm moving towards the end of this talk, I want to pick up some points here about the power of these discourses and the effects that they carry. And what was really interesting was that in the accounts that I had of young people, none of them ever spoke about class. Okay? Nobody actually mentioned it. The families wouldn't mention it. It was always about people. And yet, I want to argue that while the economic may be invisible to us, class remains an ever-present, if unacknowledged, signifier, shaping young lives. Bev Skeggs, a sociologist, in her work with white working class women, found that class was spoken through respectability. And she points out how respectability is usually the concern of those who are not seen to have it. Okay? So I think that can be very much transplanted to the real Geordies and the Chavas. Okay? And maybe goes some way to explaining why the real Geordies were so invested in this notion of respectability and their kind of white respectability. They wanted to be seen as deserving because their lives were changing and they were hanging on tooth and nail to a notion of being respectable. Okay, in a changing economy, their lives were changing, and there was a great fear, I think, of slipping back, of slipping down. And in many ways, the Chava families from these, who were undergoing unemployment, that was a place you didn't want to be. You didn't want to go. So great kind of fierce tensions around these class borders. So it's not simply about working in middle class, but it's about these intra-class borders. And in many ways, the real Geordies and Chavas were each other's other. Okay, they came to define themselves against one another, producing imaginary depictions of how each of them were like. Okay. So, I've spoken here then about class as a structuring absence, something that peppers the biographies of young people, permeates their aspirations, and shapes their life opportunities, and yet goes largely unspoken. So, the anxiety felt by the real Geordies, I think, was different for the stigmatised bodies of the Chava kids. They'd long known that they were disenfranchised and disparaged. They were regularly having to deal with the fact that they were society's underclass. So in many ways, they'd already adopted an unapologetic posture of survival, one built on hardness, street crime, and asserting themselves through particular forms of particular repertoire of masculinity. Okay, so let's have some final thoughts about what all this might mean. I've suggested that work and unemployment are not simply economic processes, but they are highly emotional and affective relations. They carry with them feelings, attitudes, and dispositions that register at local, regional, and national scales. They carry through as structures of feeling. Masculinities, then, are not something that are just produced in the present. They draw upon the past, all identities draw upon a selective past, and they're reworked in the present. Ideas about work and worklessness come to be embodied in local circuits and in institutions, such as schools, workplaces, youth clubs, and other formations. But what is also strikingly apparent is that the bodies of all working class young people are seen as out of place in a neoliberal economy that continues to fail them and to which they must respond and gain legitimacy through. So this is then presents a real tension. As an unspoken category in young men's lives, social class is rendered visible through a mobile economy of signs, discursively mapped out onto the cartography of the post-industrial city and the working and non-working bodies that lie within. Of enduring significance here is the importance of place, locality, and regional identities. So I'm suggesting that despite the turn to more postmodernist forms of thinking and the kinds of vibrant and interesting work that we've had on nightclubs and so on, there's a need to still talk about old-fashioned issues such as class, locality, and so forth. We've also seen how these things are working together, structure and culture coming together. And this can be seen in the determined preservation of older drinking customs in new times, the redeployment of terms like grafting in the present, the kind of way in which crime can be formed as almost as a cultural apprenticeship, and a fierce commitment to loyalty and notions of respect that mean you don't grass on your neighbours. So, changing and challenging times. So, perhaps I'll conclude then by just pointing to these kinds of contradictions. I suppose I'm not really presenting you with all the answers here, but at least hopefully I've got some way to offering a rich, thick description of what happens in places and how these economic changes actually connect with real lives. Okay, I'll leave it there, and this paper has been written up in sociology, but I'm happy to take any questions anyone